Welcome back to the greatest movie of all time podcast. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm David Duncan.
For our normal weekly review this week, as promised, we're bringing you the best years of our lives. But before we get to that, I think we would probably be remiss of not at least acknowledging what's going on with 2020. I don't want to go into full depth with a lot of this stuff, but there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot going on in the country. A lot of it seems very sad. I have publicly stayed silent on a lot of these things because not because I don't feel I could say something. It's I don't know how to add well to the conversation. And sometimes if you don't have anything good to say, not say it at all. We're putting out our normal content, but we do acknowledge this has been a tough year. And ultimately, the world will go on as it usually does, but we've seen a lot of people needlessly die this year in a way that is new. I'm not quite 30. I'm going to be turning 30 here in a few weeks. But this is different, and it's just sad. So
there are seminal points in history where you basically think the world as you know it is ending, but humanity and especially this country have been able to rise like phoenix from the ashes. You can go back to the Civil War. You can look at where things were as a nation and the squalor we had at the turn of the 20th century. You can look at the Great Depression. World War II seemed like the world was coming to an end. 9/11.
Yeah.
Okay. And what we have here is a culmination of two things, which is an abject rejection by a portion of society of science and the emergence of cloistered bigotry and racism that has reared its ugly head. Usually both must see the light before the virus can be killed. And I'm not meaning the COVID-19 virus. I'm talking about the lack of being thoughtful when it comes to science and knowledge and the inability to deal with racism. I come at this in a different perspective. I tend to be rather pragmatic about these events because I've been, in my 56 years, involved in a lot of different aspects of it. Having grown up in a city with a large minority population, but still, and let me just say, I have known a lot of police officers, and they were very fine men and women. Okay.
Careful with your phrasing on that one.
I think that there is a percentage of them who do abuse their power and authority. There may be some additional ones who lack the empathy and understanding of race and of culture. And it's really those individuals who have put a chalk mark on the profession as a whole. And I think that that's difficult. My biggest problem is the brotherhood of police officers has a tendency to rally around behind officers who act unjustly, and that only tends to cloud the real image, which is that we should be dealing with this inherent problem instead of trying to protect individuals who should not be police officers.
So maybe to expand on that a little bit. Part of the piece, as I've tried to digest everything, has been to take stock of the fact that the bill eventually comes due. No matter the sins of humankind, eventually you must make penance for those ills. In the circumstances that you mentioned, the Treaty of Versailles and then the eventual unwillingness to deal with Hitler before it got to a point where they couldn't deny it anymore eventually caused World War II. The aiding and abetting of Al-Qaeda to go against the Russians in 1980 and then not being able to deal with terrorism in the 90s has a direct effect on 9/11. Our level of centuries-long systemic racism and white America's fear of black people is where I would put some level of this. We've given permission to the police for too long to be able to act as godlike figures in order to protect us from what we fear, and instead of trying to be more understanding and reach out in a better manner, we've chosen to go this way, and eventually the bill comes due. To borrow a phrase, Shakespearean, but I remember it from a movie called Good Night and Good Luck. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. We still have some level of culpability beyond just the police department or, what we do, our training programs, the authorization we've given, and the rest of it. And with everything that's happened this year, it's been a powder keg boiling for the last probably 4 or 5 years. But we're just getting it where we have a confluence of significant events going on between the pandemic and quarantine and now this coming to a head. I think it's a little bit ironic. I know we chose this movie before a lot of the stuff was happening last week, but this movie, not to kind of bury the lead, is about people after a seminal tragedy and event of their lives trying to reconstruct themselves after probably their defining moment. And for a lot of people in my generation, those that are, between 20 and 40, outside of 9/11, this may be one of the most significant things to happen to you, much like the Depression or World War II was for my grandfather's generation.
More your great-grandfather at this point in time.
Well, your dad.
My dad was born in 41, so he only remembers it as a small child. Your grandparents were born after the war. So It's more of the generation at this point beyond or before them.
All right. Well,
So,
fair enough. I don't want to bog it down too much more.
I know, but it does tend to color generations. You could always tell who grew up in the Depression because they tended to be hoarders. You know, my grandparents grew up in the Depression, and they never threw anything out. Nothing. They had stuff stored everywhere because you had to be able to reuse and use everything. You know, you didn't throw a broom away because if the handle was any good, you cut the handle off. Because if another handle broke on a broom, you have a handle to replace it. Because you don't want to spend $5 for a new broom needlessly. You know, and that was a defining moment. This ultimately is done two things. One, it's rooted it out, and the other is there has been a basic level of apathy among white Americans to this situation. And I don't know if it's apathy as much as it is just diffidence. It doesn't affect me directly, so I don't have to worry about it. Yeah. But it now is the point in time where people have realized it does affect you. And you can't sit by passively anymore and just allow this to continue to happen. And so that's been the biggest change. It has nothing to do with the reaction of African Americans or other minorities. It has to do with the fact that finally we have white America saying enough.
Well, unlike some of our other episodes, this is probably a good spot to cut to our commercial sponsor, and we'll come back as ready to talk about movies and at least subjects that are a little bit simple.
And now I want to tell you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It gives you smart creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone, tablet, or computer and helps you distribute them to all the major platforms like Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, and more. Plus, they help to hook you up with sponsorships like this one, no matter the listener size, which will help you fund your podcast. And best yet, it's free to use. Look, if you've ever had an itch to talk and express yourself about a topic you like, there is no better time than 2020 to do so. I've started 2 podcasts this year alone, including this one, and we use Anchor for each and every episode. So what do you have to lose? Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started making your own podcast today.
And welcome back yet again to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast. So let's get into the 1946 Best Picture winner, The Best Years of Our Lives. You may not have a closer tie to a specific movie than this one. I normally ask you, what is your relationship to this movie? You have a bound intricacy toward this movie.
Yes, this was one of my dad's all-time favorite movies. Growing up as a child, and I am named Dana after Dana Andrews, who was one of the stars of the film.
Well, I think he's the central character. I know he didn't get the accolades that
Fredric March.
Well, not only Fredric March, but also Harold Russell got for this movie. But I do think he's the primary character. They're following all three of them, but his story and charisma kind of holds up everything else. So,
yes.
My relationship to this, you hadn't seen this before a couple of years ago when you and I first watched it, right?
Correct, because for whatever reason, I had never seen the film.
Okay. Yeah, so I enjoyed it a couple of years ago. I watched it kind of. I knew what it was going to happen in this one, but you kind of, when we've been going back and watching these, I think I watch it with a different set of eyes than I had before in almost all of these movies, and it gives you an even larger appreciation for what these movies are. We've been studying, like, we've done 2 Tarantino podcasts, 2 I'm trying to think now. Scorsese, and we've done at least 2 Billy Wilder podcasts. I think this is the first William Wyler, but he's bound to come up multiple times. I think he still holds the record for most nominations for Best Director in the course of his time. I think he has 3 total awards to John Ford's record 4. But, there are certain directors, and I think here in the near future, we're probably going to get back to Spielberg. I know there are some other major directors that we're going to be visiting, but, Wyler is kind of on that pantheon of people to visit, and this is one of the reasons why is movies like this. Notably, this has always been thought of as a deeply personal film. You and Sarah, and I kind of partially did. I never watched the full thing, but Netflix had a documentary a few years back, notably The 5 Who Came Back, about the 5 World War II directors, George Stevens, William Wyler, I'm trying to think who, John Ford.
Houston.
John Huston, yes.
Yeah.
And Frank Capra.
Yeah.
Who, came back and made some of the seminal movies of Hollywood in the 40s and 50s. I mean, Ford was making them in the 30s, and so was Capra, that got them acclaim and attention. But, these are some of the pioneers, the pillars of that 3-decade run of kind of golden age Hollywood, if you will. And this movie came up as one. I know, I do remember from the documentary, it's one that Steven Spielberg says he watches at least once a year, because it's just so deeply personal to what that situation was. And I think it'll be reflective in our scores later on, but it's one of a small handful of extremely novel films dealing with much more complicated subjects. Whereas we had a lot of John Wayne films that of World War II where he's, being all heroic and whatnot. This is much more dealing with a squishy subject matter that really wasn't explored again for, quite a few decades.
Well, just think of it this way, okay? William Wyler did a documentary about bombing missions in World War II.
Right.
And he actually flew dozens of missions on a B-17 during the war. The rate of death in the Air Corps was, I believe, 5 times what it was in the infantry. The number of planes that crashed, the number of servicemen who died were side gunners, tail gunners, bombardiers, pilots. Even if the plane didn't crash, the chances of you being shot and killed in the plane were high. Wyler actually forgot to bring his earplugs with him on one flight, and ended up irreparably damaging his hearing, and ended up being hard of hearing and having to wear hearing aids and have other have assistants help him with direction because of his lack of hearing as a result of this. Now compare this to the great war movie star of all time, John Wayne, who served. Um, in fact, um, there was a falling out late in their lives between John Wayne and John Ford, where John Ford basically called John Wayne a wimp for not serving, because John Ford filmed documentaries and was shot at and was in the line of fire repeatedly during the war, including doing his own directing from a camera located on Midway Island during the Battle of Midway. So this is more than just a film. This is really a tribute, trying for, I would assume, for Wyler to try to explain his own feelings.
And I'm kind of amazed at how positive a reception this movie got. We'll get into the recognition here. Well, I can actually go through it now. Nominated for Best Sound Recording, but it was the only nomination that it failed to win for. Won for Best Picture, Best Director for Wyler, Actor Fredric March, Supporting Actor Harold Russell, Screenplay, Film Editing, Score, and then won both an honorary award for Harold Russell that they created specifically because they didn't think he was going to win Supporting Actor, and a memorial award for the studio head for even making this movie. I mean, it was also the number 4 grossing movie pre-1950, and it's still one of these that, given its subject matter and everything about it, I'm still somewhat amazed at how well it was received and endeared within the regular culture.
Toland, is it Greg Toland, the cinematographer? I believe he was also the cinematographer for Citizen Kane. Wyler hired him to do the cinematography, and he used special camera techniques to have wide shots and to do tracking and all kinds of things so that there were less takes. It was more flow through the film. And in order to make it more enjoyable, he actually, at the theater or the studio's approval, went around to movie theaters throughout California and the West Coast and would go into movie houses and make sure their projectors were up to snuff and order replacements for lenses and such so that the cinematography was maximized for the film.
I suppose we should probably get into it, but this is just a hell of a movie. So
yes, and it's interesting because the and I cannot remember, O'Connor, I think was her name, was the woman who was playing Wilma, Harold Russell's fiancée in the film. She ended up marrying William Wyler's older brother.
Okay. I suppose that is a odd anecdote.
Yeah, they were married for a long time. So, interestingly, too, one other point is Myrna Loy considers this her greatest film, and in fact, she was one of the presenters for William Wyler's Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy. Wyler was noted for having a lot of takes. And Wyler always, Myrna Loy's comment was Wyler wanted a lot of takes because he knew when the actors weren't quite giving him everything that they had.
All right, so I'll just give the basic summary here. Fred, Al, and Homer are 3 World War II veterans facing difficulties as they re-enter civilian life. Fred, played by Dana Andrews, is a war hero who, unable to compete with more highly skilled workers, has to return to his low-wage soda jerk job. Say that 3 times fast. Bank executive Al, played by Fredric March, gets into trouble for offering favorable loans to veterans. After losing both hands in the war, Homer, played by Harold Russell, returns to his loving fiancée, but must struggle to adjust. I will say that one of the things I failed to mention with the awards for Harold Russell, he is the only person to have ever won 2 Academy Awards for the same role. And probably will never be topped.
Correct. He's also the only person that's known to have actually sold one of his Academy Awards.
Yes, to pay for his wife's, I think, cancer treatments or something in the early 90s.
Yes, and actually, since 1950, every Oscar recipient, in order to even be awarded or considered for being awarded, has to sign an agreement that before they would sell the award, they have to offer it back to the Academy for $1.
Yeah, okay.
But since his was issued in 1947, it was never done. I'd be curious to know where what happened to James Stewart's Academy Award from the Philadelphia Story, because that would have been he won an Academy Award in there somewhere, and I know for a fact that I knew from watching him on Johnny Carson where the Academy Award was in the front window of his father's hardware store in Kansas.
Okay.
He gave his dad the award. His dad put it in the front window of his hardware store, and it was there for 20 some years. So I don't know whatever happened to it, but it'd be curious to know. You know, like what does happen to the Academy Awards for people when they pass? Do they get passed down to the family, or, you know?
He did win Best Actor for the Philadelphia Story in 41.
That's what I thought.
It was the only time he'd ever won Best Actor.
Which is kind of amazing, almost, but okay.
He was nominated 5 times, but he only won once. So,
yeah.
I wonder with the new Academy Museum opening up if that would be something, but I don't know for certain. Like, all of Walt Disney's Oscars, I thought were housed somewhere. Because, I mean, there's like 40 of them, I think. But
I know Brando's from... I'm trying to remember what Academy it wasn't for Godfather, was it?
He has 2.
Well, his second one is sitting in the vault at the Academy Award headquarters yet.
Well, yeah, because he never showed up to accept it.
Oh, he sent somebody dressed as an Indian squaw.
I think it was an actual Native American. But,
there's some debate about that.
Well, either way, he was an odd character. So, all right. So, I kind of already gave my, what is this movie about, but did you have a separate one that you'd like to just generally discuss, or should we just move right into the regular categories?
Well, you can watch, and if you went through this generation, all right, and you've seen it, a little bit of it in the TV show Mad Men. Mm-hmm. I know that there was this is what led to the 60s. Okay. When these guys got to be mature adults and had some money, they had seen war, they had seen death, they had survived death, and they lived their lives to the fullest because they knew tomorrow might not come. And so they enjoyed themselves. And so alcohol was plentiful. Sex was something that you could enjoy, and quite frankly, you were not necessarily tied to certain standards anymore. And I think that starts to come out to some extent through this film. You start seeing whether it's Fredric March's character being quite a consumer of alcohol throughout the film, and others struggling in certain ways. I think it does come out.
Well, I don't know if that's the central part of this. I think if they had focused like 3 years down the line, maybe. But I think this is kind of that initial re-entrance, and so you kind of get that piece. They never really discussed the time frame of the film, but you have to think it's over a couple of months.
Oh, easily.
Just because of all of the pieces that are happening during this. So minimum I would say that it's probably 2 months, if not 3. Could be as many as 6 because you go through that whole situation with Homer and Wilma to on the back end with their eventual wedding at the end. So, all right, we'll jump into the categories. Who do you have as your best performer?
I really do think it was Fredric March. I really thought he had a real quiet presence throughout the film. He seemed to be the guy that was the one everybody in some degree relied upon, or whose opinion they all saw.
Who's what?
His approval. They sought his approval.
Oh, I guess him being the father figure. Okay.
Yes.
I thought you were going to go Wyler, but I was still going to zag you a little bit. I think it's Harold Russell. This is notably the only movie he was ever in. I think he was a crowd favorite. His acting job, if he was a trained actor, you could, be a little bit more critical. But I think for what he had to do and from where he was coming from, he's just a likable character through this whole thing and understands the exact role that he's playing. I was discussing this the other day during our Back to the Future episode, but I can't remember. I was just recently listening to something where they described how acting is just you playing yourself, playing a character. And that's why most actors, seem roughly the same in their portrayal of certain things because they're playing themselves. I mean, that's been your comment on Jack Nicholson for years, is that he's always playing the same character. Well, theoretically, other than maybe, why am I drawing a blank on his name now all of a sudden? Lincoln, My Left Foot, Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah.
Other than him, who just can disappear into certain characters, I don't know if there's any other actor that you see and they're not an exact portrayal of themselves. Whether that's Bogart playing the same character in every movie, Jimmy Stewart, John Wayne, going up through Pacino's the same character in every movie. It's just one of those things, and that's why you start to go after certain characters. I mean, casting becomes, I need somebody that reminds me of this, and you just, because you're playing a certain thing. So he could disappear into this role because he was playing himself, playing a character, and doing it incredibly successfully. I think this movie has a certain emotional resonance and a depth that's not there if he's not in the film. And for the fact that Wyler, originally the character was just supposed to be going through PTSD. He specifically sought out a more physically disabled person to be able to do this role because he thought it would translate more with an audience than PTSD, where you'd have to explore that a little bit more. He did go into that a little bit, and we'll get to that, but I do applaud the choice because I don't think this movie works as well if he's not in it.
I'll agree with that. Actually, yeah, he was a soldier, worked in demolitions, and a detonator was defective and ended up blowing off his hands. And there was a documentary that the military did on retraining of handicapped or disabled soldiers, and he was one of the soldiers in the film. And so that's where Wyler saw him and decided to cast him in that role.
I just think, all the way from backward to forward, for that inclusion, it's not the central narrative of the movie. In fact, it's probably the third banana of what's going on in this movie, but it does provide that just extra layer of depth. So, best minor performance.
I like Teresa Wright.
Okay. I thought for sure you were going to go somewhere else, and I nominated her thinking specifically that we'd have at least two diverse opinions. So I'm shocked that we ended up with the same person.
Who did you think I'd pick?
I thought you might pick like Dana Andrews, or that you'd go with the natural one because he won Best Supporting Actor, that you'd go with Harold Russell. But I definitely didn't think you'd pick Teresa Wright. All right, go ahead and give your reasoning for why you picked her, and I'll give mine after that.
Well, the part that she's playing, I mean, there was a certain element of strength about her, even though she's playing the part of a younger woman in the film. Everything I've seen her in, up through her very acrimonious departure from working for Sam Goldwyn in 1950, she did a really good job. She was a really good actress, and always had a presence in the film and never really overplayed her part. And in this one, it would have been real easy to be, to be the love sap, teeny girl, whatever. No, but there was a certain element of quiet determination, of strength, that you could see that ultimately Dana Andrews would fall for, because it's somebody that he could rely or lean on.
Yeah.
He's trying to adjust.
So the first time I saw this, I remember her being in it and I remember what happened, but her character didn't resonate with me as much as it did this time. And it's simply because there have been some personal things in my own life, which I'm definitely not getting into anytime soon, but that allow me to understand exactly where she's coming from in a lot of this film. That, she's the person that is on the outside, and she ends up falling in love with somebody that she's not supposed to, that's deeply flawed, but you're stuck in this almost unwinnable position, and instead of again, I agree with you that there could have been like this. I hate to be cliche, but like Valley Girl portrayal of it, where she's so young that it could have been overdone, where she's just like highly emotional. But because she plays such a strong character for probably 2/3 of the movie, when she has that kind of emotional bottoming out, that sets off the third act of the movie, it carries a lot more weight and gives you the impression that, this is meaningful. She wouldn't have come to this had it not been that she feels so strongly. And, it gives, again, that certain element of weight or, consequence that you wouldn't otherwise have. So.
Yeah. I had also, I mean, I guess from an honorable mention, Hoagie Carmichael was always an entertaining aspect too, as a minor performance, because he had a kind of a role to play in this that was, pretty interesting. It kind of played well, and I enjoyed his part, and I enjoyed him in the film.
Honestly, I don't think there's a character that's out of place. You could have gone in just about any direction, and it would have been credible. The only character throughout the entire movie that you come to dislike, and it's because you're supposed to dislike that person, is why am I drawing a blank? Fred's wife Marie, because that marriage is breaking.
Yeah.
And so, by just out of somewhat of a default, but she plays her character extremely well. I really just, from Wilma to Homer to Fred to Al to, Millie to Peggy, everybody in this seems to fit and know exactly what they're doing as they're continuing on. So
even Fred Dean's father, because you've spent the entire film watching Fred Dean try to struggle to get back. He didn't lead anybody, or Derry, excuse me. He was a bombardier. He didn't lead anybody. He wasn't controlling anybody. He didn't order anybody. He was not in procurement. He goes through the whole list as he's trying to find a job. And he's down and out in his luck. And Wyler, and I'm sure that this vehicle was put in there specifically, his father reads his distinguished flying cross commendation. And then you realize that this guy wasn't, that this guy really was something. And the struggles that he's had to adjust in civilian life are exemplified by the fact that in the military, he is a huge deal. That's the second highest award you can receive within the Air Force or the Army Air Corps. It's like right below the Medal of Honor, Congressional Medal of Honor. It's a big deal to have that. And
especially
I had to remind you of that.
With the amount of stories that we now have more in hindsight than we did at the time, of families finding like war medals or commendations or other things that their father, grandfather, or otherwise never talked about. It carries a little bit more in hindsight than it probably even did at the time, because we know all too well the amount of people who would just never discuss that. And it is a fitting thing. I know it's in the first part of the summary, but, he tries to downplay, to a certain extent, all three of them try to downplay their service, that they didn't do something that what they felt was heroic. They just felt like it was the thing they needed to do. I do think that's part of why, most believe it to be the Greatest Generation, but You know, there is a quiet strength in that, even if you know, it might have been somewhat unhealthy to try and keep that all repressed. So, all right, most charismatic award.
I will go with Dana Andrews on that. He did. It was obvious. You understand why he was being cast in films at that time, because he did have a presence on screen. It was a likable presence.
So every time I meet and start to like interact with a woman, you know, for purposes of socialness and dating, you know, what's the thing you're drawn the most to or whatever? I have maintained for, you know, 5 or 6 years. I finally figured it out. There is nothing that I am more of a sucker for than a good smile. I don't know what it is. And you cannot watch this movie and don't think Dana Andrews has the best smile out of anybody in this movie. He has that $1 million movie star smile. And it just breaks through. He's charismatic. You're drawn to him as being the central character, and no matter what he's doing, you always seem to root for him, even though he's getting bad break after bad break after bad break. And ultimately, that's what you need in order for that last scene to work, is for us to root for him to finally get the one good break that he needs.
Yeah. You know, and to some extent, that's kind of the epitome of his career, because he had a huge problem with addictions to opioids and to alcohol, and it ruined his career. A lot of directors refused to work with him because he was so unreliable, hungover, not show up, lots of stuff later in his career. But he always seemed to be able to pull back. He'd go on the wagon for a while, and he'd rise up. And it got to the point where, you know, where he was making some movies again in the late 50s and into the early 60s. Then he had a relapse, and then he was on television. And then he ends up his career in the 80s doing Love Boat and stuff. But again, it's partly just the fact that he was so likable that people would give him a chance, even though his history was not the best.
You said opioids there. I do want to try and clarify something, because as far as my knowledge, maybe it's my ignorance, you know, opioids as we currently understand them, I didn't think were really a thing until like the 80s and 90s.
Oh, no. Opioids would include heroin, would include any kind of, morphine is an opioid. Morphine addiction was very common. And I think that's where it came about. He was injured in a film. And so he was, of course, prescribed opioids in order to get through filming. And then he ended up addicted.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the same principle. And I'm drawing, I can picture him. Peter Lorre was a heroin. Peter Lorre was addicted to heroin. And it got to the point where a lot of directors refused to work with him. He really got his break in Hollywood from, because he had worked with, he was a Hungarian Jew who escaped Nazi Germany in the early 30s. He ran to London and worked with Hitchcock. When Hitchcock moved to Hollywood in 1940, and then directed Rebecca, he brought Peter Lorre from London with him. But then after a couple of films, he just couldn't work with Peter Lorre anymore for that reason. And but he went on to still star in several films and have a long career. But it was fairly common at the time.
Even so, I mean, he's in probably 2 of the movies that will likely be in our top 100, and that's not a bad career. So, all right, that takes us to best scene. I have a few nominees. You can add any you'd like after I kind of go through these. Al giving a loan to a veteran farmer with no collateral.
Okay.
Fred protecting Homer by knocking out the customer.
Yep.
Homer showing Wilma his, weakest moments.
Yes.
Peggy waking Fred from his PTSD nightmare. Bless you.
Yep. Sorry. Tried to hit the sneeze button, so sorry.
It's all right. And Fred visits the fighter plane graveyard. The initial scene where Alfred and Homer fly home.
Okay.
Peggy deciding to break up Fred's marriage. And finally, their first night home.
I like that story, or that scene, but you don't have one scene that I really like and thought was one of the pivotal moments of the film, is him at the banquet, Fredric March at the banquet telling basically his boss to go stick it.
See, it's maybe why I have trouble with that scene, because he's drunk in order to do it, and I don't understand that side of him to a certain extent. I don't buy it as much, which is why I kind of discount Fredric March in this movie by comparison to most other people. But I would agree that it is at least a big scene plot-wise, if it doesn't necessarily work for me.
It shows the internal turmoil. I mean, earlier in the film, and I apologize but this is the film, this is the line, last year killed Japs, this year make money. It's the whole internal conflict that he has about doing what's right versus doing what's necessary. And this was his ability. I think in part he got drunk because he thought this whole thing was a charade, and the only way he was going to get through it was to drink. And then the drink actually gave him the strength to stand up and go, I am going to do what's right, and I'm going to basically throw it in your face. And if you don't like it, well, I'll find a different job, basically.
Well, in the same regard, I will give it some credit, because it's kind of going to the point we made before. They're really only having this banquet or that dinner to celebrate him, when he doesn't make much of his own accomplishment for having just served in the war. And that he should be given this platform because he thought he was doing something that just needed to be done. And, as a result, then you get that scene. So maybe I am discounting it a little bit more than I should, and I'll grant it that. I've just never... I think he works better as the father figure in the movie than that offshoot of the stuff he has going on at the bank. His character is supposed to be adjusting to his family and his family life, and being kind of a surrogate dad for Homer and Fred, and it kind of takes on that resonance, and I think that's where he works the best. But I can credit that scene for being pivotal to the plot point. So, is that what you're choosing for best scene, or were you picking one of the other ones I had nominated?
No, I think the first night home really exemplifies the excitement and the what was taking place. They want to celebrate being home. And that was a key moment. And I do think that that's really where you develop your relationship with the characters throughout the film.
So I picked that for my favorite scene because I think it's the most lighthearted of pretty much the entire piece of the movie, and it's where we get some of the biggest comedy moments. But the one I eventually picked is them initially flying home, and just that initial part of them flying over Boone City and seeing home for the first time, kind of getting in that state of mind of re-entry and all of the complication that comes with it, and even the car ride up to that point of you have to go home, you have to reintroduce yourself into this life, you really don't have a choice. I just there's a lot more depth to this film, but that's really what it was about to begin with, and that kind of sets forth the rest of the movie.
Yeah,
them all getting to know each other and having that relationship and moving forward from that point. So that I already mentioned, I took the first night home as my favorite scene. What was yours?
I guess I would say that my favorite scene was the scene with him dealing with the farmer and the loan.
Okay. Why so?
Because I think it really showed, it was a moment where he went from being what he was before to realizing what the war had done to him and to others, and changed his outlook and his perception of where things would be from that moment on.
Yeah, I can buy that. It does fit well with the other nominee that you made, because I don't think they work well without each other. One doesn't go without, but it does. Gosh, I am finding it hard to find the right words, but give you the certain sense of where his character's at as far as re-entry to the job. I guess. I don't.
Just think about it this way: he was a bank executive. He had to basically make the choice to go into the infantry as an enlisted man, because given his background, he probably had a college education in order to be in the bank in that kind of a position. And so you would almost automatically be an officer. So he would have been having to make a conscious choice that he wanted to do the grunt work, that he wanted to do the stuff where there was real action and not necessarily be an officer. And so that fact in and of itself is significant.
All right, so we turn to most indelible moment. For me, it's the culmination of all three's war experience and how much they felt they accomplished, or how much significance they place on it on a personal level, even if they don't celebrate it. And it's Fred knocking out the customer, who basically is trying to tell them that their service is meaningless.
Yeah.
That they shouldn't have been fighting the Nazis. And honestly, I'm not as familiar with opinions of the time. It's certainly not somebody that you historically get a perspective from in that post-World War II era. I think for the way history's been written, or kind of how we remember it, it seems like everybody was universally on board with the war effort and against essentially fascism, taking over the world. And, just by laws of statistics, that's not entirely true. So when you're confronted with something of that nature, where it undercuts something, like when you have a centrally defining moment like that in your life, and somebody's trying to take that out of your identity, I wouldn't expect both of them to respond any less than how they did. And ultimately, Fred, looking out for Homer by knocking this guy out, even at the cost of his own job, it just kind of sticks with you, where that's the final, action of kind of that second act.
Okay, I can see that. For me, it was the point where Homer actually lets Wilma see him without his hooks. I think that is really what all of the servicemen tended to some extent wanted, was to be vulnerable to somebody, but felt guarded in doing so. They didn't want to feel vulnerable to anybody. And the moment he let himself down to that, it opened him up and allowed him to actually love.
Well, and to feel that he could be. I think that's the bigger part of it. I don't think he had a problem with loving Wilma. And it's a problem for all of us, is that some of us just have, I've had this a lot in my life. You don't always feel you're lovable. That there's something wrong with you, that ultimately somebody, if you show them your biggest flaws, that you're going to be scorned for it. And it does provide, again, that certain emotional weight that you wouldn't otherwise see. So, all right. So before we get into best lines and the scoring, we'll take our usual natural break. All right. That takes us to best lines. So I have a couple of nominees. This is one where I'm going to withdraw our normal funniest line category, because, there were a couple of light moments and some places where I laughed, but I don't think this is that kind of movie. So, all right. Millie Stevenson, we never had any trouble. How many times did I tell you I hated you and believed it in my heart? How many times did you tell me you were tired of me, that we were all washed up? How many times did we have to fall in love all over again?
Yeah.
That one does stick out to me in that scene where Peggy's trying to determine herself to break up Fred's marriage, and it's just simply, you sometimes lack a certain level of perspective when you've never been in a full relationship or been married for an extended period of time. When you're younger or you're single, sometimes you don't understand how difficult it is to maintain such a long relationship. So it's a reality check of sorts.
Well, and most people don't seem to understand that there's very few people that you can really be your meanest and nastiest to, because you completely let your guard down with one person, usually your spouse, and that's the problem. I mean, you say and do things to your spouse that you would never do to other people.
Well, it might be a lesson I'll eventually have to learn, but I certainly don't understand it in the same way. So,
well, and you regret it even more than if it were anybody else. But it just, when it becomes, it just happens. It's because you don't feel like you have to put on a persona with your spouse that you do with other people.
So the next one, Homer explains his character arc. I didn't see much of the war. I was stationed in a repair shop below decks. Oh, and I was in plenty of battles, but I never saw a Jap or heard a shell coming at me. When we were sunk, all I know is there was a lot of fire and explosions, and I was on the topsides and overboard, and I was burned. When I came to, I was on a cruiser. My hands were off. After that, I had it easy. That's what I said. They took care of me. Fine. They trained me to use these things. I can dial telephones. I can drive a car. I can even put nickels in the jukebox. I'm all right, but, well, you see, I've got a girl. She knows what happened to you, doesn't she? Sure, they all know. They don't know what these things look like.
Yeah. That is a good line.
Well, it gives his character arc within a few lines. All you'll need to know about where he's going to be for the rest of the movie is in that introduction, and I think it's no coincidence it's in the early stages of this movie. So, next one, Al reacting to Homer's homecoming. They couldn't train him to put his arms around his girl or to stroke her hair.
Yeah.
Another just, emotional resonance line. So, and the final one I had, the final conversation between Marie and Fred. What do you think I was doing all those years? I don't know, babe, but I can guess. Go ahead, guess your head off. I could do some guessing myself. What were you up to in London and Paris and all those places? I've given you every chance to make something of yourself. I gave up my own job when you asked me. I gave up the best years of my life. And what have you done? You flopped. Couldn't even hold that job at the drugstore. So I'm going back to work for myself, and that means I'm going to live for myself too. And in case you don't understand English, I'm going to get a divorce. What have you got to say to that? Don't keep Cliff waiting.
Yeah.
So, did you have any other nominees?
I do like the line about, where it's Fredric March and his wife, and Myrna, and they're discussing, we had a couple of kids, didn't we? And then goes on kind of like that little parry and thrust back and forth, kind of playful. I enjoyed those set of lines.
All right. Any other ones that stick out to you?
Well, I do enjoy too, as I pointed out earlier, the scene of him at the or Fredric March at the banquet, and he tells the story about, that's going to be a big risk to take that hill, sir, and we don't have any collateral. So.
Yeah, I know that fits in with what you've already been talking about quite a bit. So, as far as best line, I think I'm going to go with that final exchange between Marie and Fred, just because, as I've discussed it before, it's kind of that summation piece. My honorable mention will go to Millie Stevenson's We Never Had Any Trouble. What do you have down?
I'm sorry, I was just thinking of a particular thing, and I missed the question, actually. I'm sorry. I don't do that very often when we're recording these, but I was thinking about some other aspect of the film that just popped into my head.
Well, go ahead.
Well, no, I one of the unsung heroes of the entire film is Butch's place. The bar. Yeah. And I just stopped into my head. The number of times that men, especially of my age, just to have a place to go And to have friends, close friends that you share an experience with and share a level of camaraderie is amazing. And that's something that those three had. And it's in that location that I think that there's a longing for a lot of men in their lives.
So I'll make two comments off of that. I think part of the reason that's resonating with you as much as it is. Number one, we've been incredibly antisocial now for 3 months with a full-out quarantine. And it's quite possible we're not socializing in the same way that we had been for another 3 months minimum, if not longer. So, we're rediscovering how much we need to be social creatures in an era where, yes, we were able to, and you and I have been doing all of these podcasts via Skype. A ton of the other ones are doing it via Zoom or whatever, and you're able to connect, but it's only so much, and that there is something to be said for being social. But the other aspect of this, and I don't discount it, and why it resonates with you, is you just binge watched all 11 seasons of Cheers. The entire thing of Cheers is going to some place where everybody knows your name. I mean, that's the whole show. But, I don't care. You talk about any group of people or any sitcom, and you have a central binding force in that sitcom. Mary Tyler Moore, The Office, and Parks and Recreation are bound by workplace comedies, even MASH to a certain extent. Cheers and Friends and How I Met Your Mother are social hangout groups as camaraderie. And then you have, a couple of other but there's always some type of backbone. Family Ties or All in the Family, it's, having to do with the family structure. Family Matters, is that the one with Urkel from the 90s? The Cosby Show. So whatever it is, there's a structural group of people that have a central backbone of being together in some capacity. In that particular show, that's what it was. But, there's a reason that bars and coffee shops and other things, because as much as we think social media can replace some of our interactions, there are a lot of people still seeking community in this world, and it's something that we should not just recognize but appreciate. So the point is taken.
Well, anyway, that was just, I lost track because I was just thinking about that aspect of it.
So, I don't know about you. I don't really have any remaining questions on this movie. It's pretty compact. There really isn't any major open-ended thing like it's a plot hole or science fiction or something that can't be explained. It's pretty tightly wound. So we'll just do the grading here briefly. We'll grade this one out and cut it there, if that's good with you.
That sounds fine.
So, Legacy. I'll just give my background. This is one that I think is a player in Golden Age Hollywood, but it's not on the same level or as appreciated as some of the movies around it. Casablanca, Citizen Kane, Gone with the Wind are all within that 3 to 4 year window just before this. It's not as celebrated as some of the films of the 50s just after it, or even the early 60s. So as much as this one has a legacy, I think it's, to the general public, kind of lost. And that's kind of sad. But I do think, and I take it back to that, or where I started and made that point before, that, Spielberg in that documentary we saw highlights this as a film he's going back to every year. I think it has an appreciation among those in film circles that it doesn't to the general at large. So for that reason, I will give it. I have to knock it down a few points, but I'm going to give it 8.5.
I'll actually agree with that. I was going to go 8, but I'll go with 8.5 because I think mine may have been a little low.
I still think there's something there. It just doesn't have the history tale that, maybe I believe it should have. And so, as a result, it's kind of unfortunate, but oh well. So, impact, significance. Again, this movie won, I think, 8 Academy Awards. Let's see here. Let me just count them once. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So with both the honorary and memorial awards for Goldwyn and Harold Russell, 9 awards in 1947 for this movie. That's a huge total. It was probably the movie of post-war readjustment. And I still do think it has resonance among a film student or like certain circles of film critics and appreciation. So I actually put it as a 9.5.
I had it 9, but I'll go 9.5. And I'll tell you, if you talk to a veteran who's not familiar with the film and you tell them what the film is about, almost all of them are like, well, you really should see that film. This is one of these films, for whatever reason, is not highly publicized. But when you watch it, you go, wow, why is this film not more popular?
Yeah, it's one of those, it's sometimes unusual which ones gain traction and which ones don't. So, but I do think this should be higher. And, it was the number 4 grossing film of all time before 1950. This thing got played again and again and again. It got re-released multiple times. I just think with the public at large, but it's lost some luster over the years, which is why, the legacy is lower than that. For the same reason, I had 9.5 for novelty. Some of the things they're talking about, Fred's PTSD dream that he keeps having over and over, just the fact that they're even talking about it.
Yeah. In the film, in 5 Came Back, it talked about how John Huston wanted to do a film about treatment for PTSD. And he had to jump through hoop after hoop after hoop. And then he did the film, and the Army quashed it, wouldn't allow it to be released because it went too far. And they thought it would give them or put them in bad light. Subsequently, it was years after that he was able to finally release the film. So this is cutting edge to be talking about it.
Well, and, I know that there were a few films regarding re-entry post-World War I that gained a little bit of traction, but this was the first one out of the gates post-World War II and really resonated with the country as a whole. So I don't think it anything other than its subject material, well, and the fact that they're featuring a disabled veteran. I mean, that alone, it bumps it extremely high up the list.
Yeah.
It's not something that you were going to do, put a non-actor for what they're capable of doing into the role and have it be so incredibly successful. So I went with a 9.5.
I'll agree with you.
Interesting. Okay. So that's already 3 borne out. So classicness, there are a few pieces, and you already kind of got into it a little bit. There are some racial slurs in here that are a product of the time that obviously don't age well. I understand its place within history, but, also the fact that Boone City looks to be exclusively white for being a supposedly metropolitan city of the day. I understand that, this is
Well,
1980s Hollywood, but still.
it was pretty white, even though it was supposed to be metropolitan. It was supposedly Cincinnati.
I see. Okay.
And so Cincinnati being a border city with Kentucky, it tended to be a little more segregated than most northern cities.
Well, I mean, yeah, I won't get into that one. That one's for a different podcast at a different time. But what did you have down for classicness?
I had an 8, simply because it is a certain aspect dated. The relationship with women,
Yeah, the alcoholism. I had a tough one with this one. I don't think it's terrible comparative to some other movies where there are some like cringe. I didn't have any real cringy moments, but there are some things that aren't great about this.
You can say that. Yeah.
I had it down as a 9, but I think, the average adjustment between ours at an 8.5 is probably about right.
Okay.
So, finally, rewatchability.
This is the second time I've watched the film, and I regret not having watched it before. This is a film that I could easily watch once a year and enjoy. So I would have to give it about an 8.5 or a 9.
I'm with you, and I'm having a difficulty where, like, I don't want to give 10s, but I think 9 would be, like, if I put it at a grading scale, 9 would be if I'm visiting this movie, like, once every 6 months. So if I'm going to visit it, like, once a year or once every 2 years, then we're talking about 7 to 8 in that range. So I put it at about a 7.5. I don't know. I probably would be just fine showing this to new people all the time, but I don't know if it's one I'm going out of my way to watch. So I had it at a 7.5.
Well, and I think that it's one of these that if I'm thumbing through the station and I see it on, I would sit and watch, the last 45 minutes of the film.
Yeah, and I could buy that. Honestly, I think it's a lot more rewatchable than other films on some of the same subject material, because all of the characters, ultimately, you find them to be redeemable or people that are deserving, and you root for all of them. And, sometimes it's just good to have, people that you want to root for. So you had an 8.5 or a 9 then, just so I can average this out.
8.5.
All right, so then we'll average it out to an 8, which I think that's probably about fitting. So the audience score was a 93, so that puts it at 9.3 points. So final score is a 53.3. And let me just pull up the other list here once. Normally I have this pulled up well in advance, but... So 53.3 puts it at number 2 on the list. We've actually had the 2 top movies on the list are the last 2 that we've had episodes on. So it just comes below Back to the Future from our earlier in the week.
Oh. Okay.
I think that's going to be one we may have to revisit because it's heavily weighted by a couple of super fans of that particular movie. So.
Okay.
So at some point we may have to revisit that one to give it a little bit better weighting, but that's not terrible. We need nominees to revisit at some point, kind of MythBusters style. So
I still think that, and we've talked about this off air, but I'm just going to throw it out. And if anybody at all thinks this would be a good idea, I think we should do an episode where we discuss character actors.
We could probably create an easy bonus episode on that at some point here in the near future, and kind of just give our ranking of that. But I maybe save that for season 2. Yeah, because I think we need to have a third person.
Yeah,
if it was
everybody from Gabby Hayes to Walter Brennan to
I already know who I think is probably one of the top 5.
Who?
John Cazale.
Okay.
I mean, you think about John Cazale's 4-movie run that he has. He is in both of the first 2 Godfather movies, most notably in Godfather Part 2. He's the other bank robber in Dog Day Afternoon and in The Deer Hunter.
Okay.
Like, he's one of these storied people, and he's, also notably the love of Meryl Streep's life, but, it's just one of those things, so.
Okay.
So, but, I think there are a couple of others that you could really nominate as, like, great supporting actors.
Ward Bond.
I know he hasn't been in a ton of them, but like every time he is, because he's never the lead. But J.K. Simmons is just fantastic.
Yeah, so. I always enjoy some of the other ones. Stanley Tucci.
Yeah.
One of those actors that's just always does a phenomenal job at whatever he's doing.
As good as she was as a leading lady, though, too, I think Katharine Hepburn doesn't always get as much credit as she was probably due as a really great supporting character. Normally, she's playing second fiddle in almost everything she's doing, but the amount of times that I think she made Spencer Tracy or whomever, Bogart, she was working against better because of how good she was. That's one of those. So
anyway,
it's a good idea for later on, but that's probably a great place to cut for this. I wish we could talk longer, but I'm expecting a friend for dinner. As usual, please rate, subscribe, and review our podcasts. 4 and 5 stars would be greatly appreciated. If we continue to increase our international audience, I think we're now in 15 different countries. We may have to start creating some swag or merch. So I don't know if we have any key phrasing on the podcast episode, but to all of our loyal fans out there right now, we did have our first international podcast this week. So we'll see how that one goes. It took me a while to edit that episode, but thank you everybody that's been listening and supporting the show. And next week I'm planning to be back with you for Roman Holiday. And then we haven't decided what we're going to do after that yet. So I'll have some options for you upcoming. So thanks, Go ahead.
No, what episode number will that be?
Roman Holiday?
Yeah.
18.
So we got a couple more to get to 20. Okay.
And our special halfway mark is episode 25, which we haven't announced yet. So, but that should be upcoming in a few weeks. Hopefully we have a couple of other guest host surprises coming up soon. So until next week, have a great week, everybody.